Hey, so today we are talking about Marissa Licon and the pure gold forensics testing in the Edrick Faust versus Georgia trial. So, if you watched the trial, you would know that Pure Gold Forensics is a company in California, and the GBI sent two oral swabs over there to have them tested. And that was from the SA kit. Yeah. So 2I was oral swab B and 2J was oral swab A. So what was tested was small cuttings from those swabs that were sent over. And the tests that they did, both presumptive, RSID for saliva, and Lugol's iodine is a presumptive test for the presence of glycogen. So glycogen is present in epithelial cells, which are skin cells. And vaginal epithelial cells contain a higher amount of glycogen, but they don't, it's not just those cells that have glycogen. So that's why it is a presumptive test. And there isn't actually any confirmatory test for figuring out if cells are vaginal or not. So the 2I oral swab B tested positive for saliva on the presumptive test, and it tested negative for glycogen on the presumptive test. Then 2J oral swab A tested negative for saliva and positive for glycogen at more than 10%. So the way they figure that out is they look at it and they decide how much or what percentage of the cells are stained brown, because that indicates that there is a presence of glycogen. And they come to that conclusion just based on an observation. Again, both of these are presumptive tests that are not usually allowed in court because there isn't enough research to back them up. So what the state did following these tests is they decided that 2I could still be an oral swab, and that's what they said. So that is an oral swab. And then 2J was actually mislabeled, and it's actually a vaginal swab. Why did they do this? Well, the problem is that when they tested these swabs, they found on oral swab B, which is 2I, this one here, they found Edrick's DNA. They did not find Chris Melton's DNA. On 2J, oral swab A, they found both Edrick and Chris's DNA. Now, if that was also an oral swab, that would be a problem for the state because of the time frames that are widely accepted as to how long DNA lasts in different areas of the body. So in the mouth, DNA doesn't last as long because, there's a lot going on in the mouth. It tends to kind of clear out quickly. So that was a problem because they're trying to pin it on Edrick, but if Edrick and Chris both have their DNA there, then that doesn't work for Chris. So by doing these tests, it allowed them to say that Chris's DNA was found on the vaginal swab, and so was Edrick's. But using their totally outdated theory that Chris's DNA is supposed to be there because he's the boyfriend, right? And he apparently he was intimate with her on the Sunday prior, apparently. So that's how they are able to explain away Chris's DNA and say, oh, well, that's okay, it's supposed to be there. So can you see why these tests were so important? Because otherwise they have nothing. I mean, they've got nothing anyway, but even less they would have. So obviously the defense put in lots of motion to try and exclude this evidence because it's lacking in evidence, scientific evidence, and, all of that. So we're going to go through some of the motions, and they were all denied, of course. So this one was on the 2nd of October, where they want to know which witnesses are going to be called, and then they're talking about the Lugol's iodine test and that it's a presumptive test. It cannot differentiate between the different epithelial cells within the body because said test is a glucose detection test, not a test that detects the presence of tissue. So that's why it's presumptive, because you need to follow it up with a confirmatory test. So they're arguing that it constitutes speculative evidence. Then they're asking about Licon's CV because they weren't, obviously they wanted to have a look at her qualifications and see if she had the relevant education and experience to present this in court. So that's that one. The next motion was filed on the 16th of October, and this is following the defence receiving the CV for Licon and several photos from her office. So Licon is saying 2I had saliva, but it was negative for glycogen, or less than 10%. And then 2J had no indications of saliva, but greater than 10% of the cells stained positive. To make the jump that, so because Licon is going to be basically an interpretation of what the presumptive tests mean, it would have to meet certain standards. So that's what they're going on to argue here. And they're asking for the state to show, or they're saying that the state should show that Licon has training in histology, understanding of glycogen biochemistry and Lugol's staining mechanisms, knowledge of forensic validation studies on Lugol's iodine testing, being able to differentiate between the cells, and or experience applying and interpreting the technique on aged, decades-old forensic samples. And her CV shows none of that. So her experience is in DNA analysis, not histology. But they go on to say that the state cannot meet its burden in showing that Ms. Licon is qualified to testify that no indications of saliva proves a non-oral origin, that the swab was a vaginal swab, or combine it with Lugol's iodine test to relabel a 23-year-old swab, because such conclusions are outside her training and the scientific scope of the RSID saliva test. So it's not good. So they're talking about, there's never been controlled and testable experiments about this, and glycogen rapidly degrades. So they're doing these tests on 23-year-old swabs. And the other thing is that we don't know how much of the swab they actually had, because it was just cuttings. And because it's a presumptive test, you don't know how the size of the sample actually affects the reliability of the results. So yeah, they're talking about that. But they're going on to argue that what Miss Licon is going to do is combine the results of both of the tests and then make an inference that would lead to the reclassification of one of the swabs. But there is no scientific backing for that. And it says here, her background qualifies her to perform and report RSID test results, but not to integrate two unrelated tests into a new biological source theory. Yeah, so that was on the 16th. Also on the 16th, they put in for a request for additional discovery. So they're wanting the case file, administrative documentation or paperwork, lab protocols, work instructions, chain of custody, and current disposition of evidence, standard operating procedures, accreditation, product throughput data for forensic testing section, lab personnel, Licon's experience, education, a copy of all lab documents of forensic testing, issues related to quality control, communications, quality assurance, quality control, Licon's quality assurance, validation studies, Lugol's iodine testing studies, validation of proficiency data for combined test, epithelial identification error rate, forensic community acceptance, images and slide records, reagent log and lot numbers, previous lab errors, internal audit reports, control slides and test runs, and oversight. So they've asked for that. And then on the 21st of October, they put in a motion for subpoena return date. And that's because they didn't respond to the motion, which is not surprising. It hasn't been disclosed. And then, so they're requesting a subpoena return date so that they can have the items requested in that discovery request, which we just looked at before. So here is the subpoena for production of evidence. So it's just, again, listing all the things that were in the motion. So it was denied that they didn't get all of that information. And to me, that just shows that something very sketchy is going on. They probably didn't have a lot of that information. There definitely wasn't any scientific backing for the conclusions that she tried to make about the swabs. So, yeah, it was just denied.